I do want to transition to this G League stuff because, as I said off the top, when I recorded on Thursday, it was one of those deals where I was waiting because I knew Jalen Green was almost certainly going to take the pro path through the G League, and especially last week with all the stories about Terrence Clark being recruited, Jalen Suggs, the Gonzaga commitment being recruited. I knew this was probably going to be a big story, and so I waited until after the news happened to actually record. And what ended up happening was I recorded in real time, and I obviously reacted, and I think I mean, let's be honest, I'm AT. I did a great job reacting, but I think that there were some things that even came up after I recorded that I hadn't considered before I hit the record button. And so I think what's important to say is this topic, like everything else, what media you choose to consume will dictate what opinion you get. Because it was really funny, as I knew I was going to talk about this again today, I just did a quick Google search, Jalen Green, G League, Jalen Green, Memphis, all these kind of things. And of course, the NBA-centric websites, this is the death of college basketball, and this is the greatest thing. By the way, shout out to the NBA. Putting a rule in place, the one and done, that doesn't allow these kids to go to the NBA straight out of high school, then also getting credit for putting in a new rule to circumvent the first rule that they put in. So shout out to the G League, or shout out to the NBA. But then also you read college basketball writers that are saying it's not a big deal at all. And I do think it's somewhere in the middle. As I said on Thursday, it was not a great day for college basketball, but the more I really look at the information, the more I really peel back the layers, the more questions that I have. And I'll give you guys a ton of credit because a bunch of you asked me the same question. They said, and you guys asked me, what is in it for the NBA? Why are they investing so much money with obviously zero financial return? And we're not even positive that there's going to be a figurative return either. And so let's get into it, because the more that I think about it, the more that I have questions on the long-term viability of this program for both the player and the NBA, and the G League obviously as one. From the player's perspective, I kind of did talk about it on the last show, but I really do think that it's worth repeating, is that I think that for the player's perspective, I think it's easy for somebody who doesn't understand the nuance. And the one thing, obviously, look, I just spent 23 minutes talking about the one and done rule. AT does nuance, okay? Nobody does nuance like AT. Maybe I give you too much nuance sometimes. But I think for people who don't understand the nuance, the headline is, high school kid gets $500,000 to play basketball without going to college. Every single elite player will choose that path. And first of all, that's just not true, because if you look at this season, we've already had multiple players that were offered this path that have turned it down. Terrence Clark, a Kentucky commit, turned that path down. Zaire Williams, who committed to Stanford last week, was offered the same path, turned it down. Evan Mobley, who's committed to USC. Now, his father coaches there. It's a little bit of a different deal, but turned down this path. And so I'm bringing it up. So first of all, for everyone that says every elite kid is going to take this path, I don't buy it. I do believe there are going to be some that take it, because I'll be honest, I think there's a lot of parents that are in this for money and not in it for what's best for their kid, not in it for just letting their kid be a kid. And so listen, I'll tell you this because he's a professional now, and I feel bad for the kid. But I've been basically told for a year that Jalen Green's stepdad has just been fishing around for the best professional offer that he could get, and that there was never any intention, especially after RJ Hampton went to Australia, there was never any intention for Jalen Green to go to college. And I do think, by the way, I think he's one of the rare exceptions that I don't think he needs college. I don't think physically he's quite ready yet, but he's so explosive, so talented. That kid could literally sit out for a year and still be a top 5 pick next year. But I bring this up because I do think there are some questions from the player's perspective, which I want to get into, and I talked about most of them, so I'll kind of gloss over them because I did talk a lot about them last week. The first one is the actual schedule of all this, right? So let's assume that without the coronavirus pandemic, let's just say that these guys kind of congregate and get together on June 1st, right? July 1st, whatever. Well, based on what we know about this program, and we'll find out more in the coming weeks, it's a whole lot of practicing and not a lot of games. And I think that's part of it that people are underselling here. Is, say what you want about college basketball, you basically get from November 5th to April 1st if you play in the championship. You get 2 or 3 games a week every week. You get to go to Maui. You get to go to Atlantis. You get to play in big, exciting venues. And I'm not saying that the quality of play is better in college basketball than it is in the G League. And I'm not saying that playing in front of 20,000 fans is the only reason to choose college basketball. But these guys are competitors. You don't get to be an elite top 10 high school player if you don't love to compete. Well, some of them do, but for the most part, you don't unless you love to compete. And so I only bring that up because I just don't know how appealing the idea of being set up in LA somewhere. LA's fun, but if all you're doing is practicing all day, all you're doing is lifting all day, I don't know how appealing this program is going to be because from my understanding, there's only going to be about 12 to 20 games all year long. That's like 1 a month. That's like 2 a month. And they're in small gyms. They're with no fans. They don't count for anything. I mean, isn't part of why we play sports to compete for a championship? Isn't that why Zion Williamson decided to play rather than shutting it down? It's because he wants to compete. He wants to play. He wants to beat the other team's brain in. And it's the same with all these guys. It's the same with Tyler Hero. Tyler Hero's a great basketball player. That guy wants to compete. That guy wants to play. He's a bucket. I go on and on and on. But the point is, I don't think this 20-game schedule is really all that appealing to these kids. And then, again, it also goes back to what I said last week. It's great for a Jalen Green. Jalen Green is a stud. Jalen Green is a rock star. Jalen Green is really good. I think he could have competed for National Player of the Year next year had he gone to Memphis. But he doesn't need this program to reach his potential. But what I said was last week, and if you missed the episode, go back and listen to it. What about all these other kids? What about the risk that they're taking? Yeah, first of all, let's remember, Jalen Green is getting $500,000. My understanding is not all of these guys are. So let's say Isaiah Todd, he's the 12th ranked player in the class. He gets, instead of $500,000, he gets $350,000. Let's say the 18th ranked player gets $150,000. At a certain point, yes, being paid is good, but what are you risking in the process? First of all, you don't get to play games. You don't get to do any of the fun stuff that comes with playing basketball, but what are you risking? Because when you are practicing all the time, when you are training all the time, when you are going through drills all the time, that's kind of boring, right? Like that's kind of like, that's kind of like, well, whatever. And if you have a bad attitude, if you don't love basketball, if you don't love to practice, if you don't love to get better without the bright lights of a game, I think you can be exposed. By the way, I think you can be exposed simply by playing against bigger, stronger, better athletes than you. And I know this whole idea of, well, they're going to bring in older players to be mentors and blah, 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 blah. Those older players are still competing for roster spots too. And there's no better way to show that you're still ready to go than by punking an 18-year-old every day. And so I know it's easy to sit here and say, well, Jalen Green and, all these kids are going to choose it. It's like, I don't know, man. I think some of them are going to get really exposed. And I think some of them, it's really going to hurt their draft stock. Because this isn't going to Australia where nobody really sees you except maybe a scout comes over for a couple games. This isn't going to work out by yourself for a year where nobody gets to be in the gym with you and nobody can see. You're going to be in front of NBA personnel every day. And when you're playing these games, you're going to be in front of scouts every single game. And while I do think that could be a huge benefit to some of these kids, I do think it could be a huge drawback. So from the player's perspective, I think it's a slam dunk. Oh, of course, so they're all going to take the money. I don't think so. First of all, we had a bunch turn it down already. And second of all, what happens if an Isaiah Todd goes from a projected top 15 pick in the preseason to the 28th overall pick because he gets exposed behind the scenes? It's something to think about. I also got to be honest, and this was a great point that so many of you brought up, which is, what is the real benefit of this from the NBA's perspective? Now, look, I get it. You get to say, hey, the best players came through our developmental program. Well, first of all, Jalen Green was going to be a top 3 pick, whether he played at Memphis next year, whether he played at Auburn next year, whether he sat out, whether he went to Australia, whether he went to the G League. That kid's going to be a top 3 pick. He doesn't need to go work out in some weird facility in Los Angeles with a bunch of has-been NBA players to realize that the kid's great. He's a fantastic player. But did you need to invest millions of dollars in him to find that out? No. You could have let Memphis do all the investing or Auburn do all the investing, which we're going to get into in a minute. But I look at it from that perspective. I look at it also from the perspective of think about, and this is the best point that anybody's brought up. Think about how much money the NBA is investing into this program, okay? So I think the easy headline is Jalen Green, $500K. Isaiah Todd's going to make somewhere in there. And let's say 3, 4, 5 more high school players decide to take this path. Well, now you're looking at like $1 million, at minimum, $1 million just in salary. Plus, oh, by the way, you got to find a facility for them to work out. You got to pay the strength and conditioning coach to work them out. You got to figure out who's coaching these guys. You got to pay them. You got to bring in these 6, 7, 8, 10 veterans to play with these guys every day. You got to bring them to travel to play games. You got to bring them, there's been talk they're going to overseas to play some games. Like, that's a lot of money to invest in 18-year-old kids who are already good. Especially, I should mention, during this coronavirus pandemic. You all saw the story. The NBA is going to cut 25% of players' paychecks this next pay cycle because they can't afford to pay their bills. And now you're investing, I think, easily. You got to be a couple $1 million. For what? To know that Jalen Green's a really good draft prospect? We already knew that. And so I think it's such a great point that all of you have brought up is what is the upside of this for the NBA? What is the upside for these kids? For the kids, we get it. But what is the upside for the NBA? I get they want to have a developmental program. I get they want to have the alternate path. But I think at a certain point they're going to realize we're investing tens of millions of dollars to develop players that are already pretty much developed, that don't need our development. Now look, maybe Jalen Green comes out of this and he becomes the number 1 pick and he becomes the best player in the NBA within 2 years, and it's this smashing success. Like, I don't think this program is really going to change Jalen Green's trajectory. And so that's why I think this is so interesting to look at from the NBA's perspective. Because, again, they're investing tens of millions of dollars in, at the very least, one kid who we already know is a superstar, and we're investing all this money in kids that are outside of Jalen Green a lot less certain. And so I think it becomes a question of two things. Is it worth investing in players that we already know are good? And what happens if a couple of these guys miss? Is it worth the investment of $250K, $300K, $400K into a kid that isn't that good or that doesn't love basketball? I don't know. Maybe the NBA feels like it's worth it even in this coronavirus time when money is tight. But I'm just saying that feels weird to me. And I think it's something that the NBA is going to have to think about. I think they're going to have to think about, do we want to be in the developmental business? And by the way, NFL draft is on Thursday. At some point, I'll actually, on the next episode, I was going to talk about it today, but I'm running out of time. At some point, I'll probably talk about the NFL draft. But the NFL has it figured out, and I give them so much credit because they figured out, the NFL's like, dude, we're not a developmental league. We got this great developmental system called college football. And you know who does all our developing? Clemson and Alabama and Ohio State. And they spend millions. Now, they actually have a business model that works because they make a lot of money too. They spend millions to house these kids, to train these kids, to teach them to go from boys to men, to educate these kids, which, by the way, that's another element of it. Jalen Green, supposedly his college is paid for. So that's like an extra $250K on top of anything if he ever decides he wants to come back to college. But go back to college football. It's a great developmental system for the NFL, and the NFL realizes that. They get Joe Burrow at 23 years old, ready to play day one, and he's already a superstar. They get Tua at 20 years old, ready to be a superstar. We know who these guys are. In the NBA, I think they're going to realize, you know what? We might be pretty good at this developmental thing, but is it worth it? Why don't we just let Duke spend all the money developing these guys? Why don't we let Kentucky and Kansas and Michigan State and North Carolina and Memphis, why don't we let those guys, they're doing a good job already. They're giving us good players already. Is it worth it for us to invest millions of dollars when the end product is the same? Or is it better to cut our loss, let these kids go to college, and come to us as more finished products? And I think the NBA, I think it's going to be a very interesting year and couple years figuring out if this program is really worth it. Is it really worth spending millions of dollars? I think it's going to be upwards of easily $10 million when this thing is all said and done. Is it really worth it? And maybe for Adam Silver, who, as I've said a couple times now, he wants to be the knight in shining armor. He wants to save all these poor college kids that are being exploited in college basketball. but maybe in a little bit he realizes that it's not worth it. It'll be fascinating to watch. I will say one thing, though. One thing working against college basketball is this coronavirus, because I do think a lot of kids are looking at it and saying, well, if I'm not going to have a college season anyway, I might as well go get paid. So that is something to watch out for. Hopefully we get back to some semblance of normal soon.